Dante Rossi slammed the folder shut so hard that the glass on his desk rattled. Elena Marchetti did not flinch. She had worked for him for 2 years, and she had learned long ago that his temper was loud, but his bite was slow. She stood across from him with a cup of coffee in her hand, calm as still water, waiting for him to say whatever he needed to say. "You are telling me this now?" Dante asked, his voice low and sharp. "I told you 3 days ago," Elena said. "You just were not listening. I do not remember you telling me that you have a date tonight." "Well, I did, and I need to leave by 6. Dante stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, something he did not want her to see. He looked down at the folder on his desk instead, pretending the papers inside were suddenly the most important thing in the world. "6 is not possible," he said flatly. "We have the shipment numbers to review, the meeting with the accountant, and the call with the Chicago office. You cannot leave at 6. Elena tilted her head, studying him. In 2 years, she had seen Dante Rossi deal with rivals, with liars, with men who tried to cheat him out of money. She had seen him cold, controlled, terrifying when he needed to be. But she had never seen him like this, irritated over a schedule, over something as ordinary as her evening plans. "The accountant meeting was already moved to tomorrow," she said. "You know that. And the Chicago call is at 3, not 6. "I already checked." Dante's jaw tightened. He hated when she was right, and she was almost always right. That was one of the reasons he trusted her with things he trusted no one else with. It was also one of the reasons her words tonight had landed somewhere deep and uncomfortable inside his chest. "Who is he?" Dante asked suddenly. "Excuse me?" "The man. Who is he?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "Why does that matter?" "Because everything that happens around me matters," Dante said, standing up now, walking slowly around his desk. "You work for me. You know things. If you are seeing someone, I need to know who." Elena almost laughed, but she caught herself. She knew better than to laugh at Dante Rossi when his voice had that edge to it. Still, she could see through him more clearly than he realized. "His name is Oliver," she said. "We met a few weeks ago. He is a teacher. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that concerns you." "Everything concerns me," Dante said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. The office fell silent. Outside the window, the city was waking into afternoon light, cars moving in slow lines below, people living lives that had nothing to do with the empire Dante had built, brick by brick, threat by threat, deal by deal. Inside this room, though, something small and human was happening, something Dante did not have a name for yet. "I need you to look over the ledgers before you go anywhere," he said, changing the subject as fast as he could. "All of them, every page. That will take hours. Then you had better start now." Elena studied him for one more second, then set her coffee down and picked up the stack of ledgers from the side table. She did not argue. She rarely argued with him directly, not because she was afraid of him, but because she understood him. She understood that this sudden pile of work was not really about the ledgers. By 2 in the afternoon, she had finished the ledgers faster than he expected. She walked back into his office and placed the folder neatly on his desk. "Done," she said. "Anything else?" Dante looked up, surprised. He had been certain the task would keep her busy until at least 4. He glanced at the clock, then back at her. "The security reports," he said. "I need those checked too. Every camera log from the past week." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, just enough for him to notice. "That is normally Marco's job." "Marco is busy." "Marco is standing right outside your door." Dante's gaze flicked toward the hallway, where indeed his second-in-command, Marco, was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, clearly listening to every word with an amused expression on his face. Marco had known Dante since they were teenagers running errands for men far more dangerous than either of them had become. He knew Dante's moods the way a sailor knows the weather. "Marco," Dante called out. "Come here." Marco walked in, trying and failing to hide his smile. "You called, boss?" "Take the security reports." "Sure thing." Marco picked up the folder Elena had been about to grab, glancing between the two of them with barely concealed curiosity. "Anything else you need me to steal from Elena's afternoon?" "That is enough," Dante said sharply. Marco raised his hands in mock surrender and walked out, but not before shooting Elena a look that said clearly, he is not fooling anyone. Elena bit back a smile of her own. So, she said, turning back to Dante, what is next on the list of things that absolutely cannot wait until tomorrow? Dante opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had nothing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had run out of reasons to keep her in this office. Nothing, he said finally, the word coming out stiffer than he intended. You can go prepare for your date. The word tasted strange in his mouth, like something foreign and unwelcome. Elena noticed the shift immediately, the way his voice changed when he said the word date, like it physically cost him something to say it out loud. Thank you, she said simply, and turned to leave. She did not get far. Dante's voice stopped her at the door. Elena. She turned back. Yes? For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something real, something that had nothing to do with ledgers or security reports or schedules. His eyes held hers a beat too long, and the air in the room grew heavy with something unspoken. Then, just as quickly, his expression closed again, the mask sliding back into place. Be careful tonight, he said instead. The city is not always safe. I will be fine, Elena said gently. It is dinner, not a mission. Everything can turn into a mission, Dante muttered, almost too quiet for her to hear, but she heard it anyway. She left his office with those words, following her down the hallway, settling into her thoughts, like a stone dropped into still water. She had known Dante Rossi long enough to read between his lines, and today, those lines were practically shouting something he refused to say directly. Down the hall, Marco was waiting for her, arms still crossed, that same knowing smile on his face. You know what that was, right? He said. What? That whole performance, the ledgers, the security reports, the sudden need to keep you here until sundown. Marco shook his head, chuckling under his breath. That man has never once cared about camera logs from a week ago. He is just being thorough, Elena said, though even she did not fully believe her own words. Thorough? Marco repeated, laughing outright now. Sure, let us call it that. Elena walked past him toward the elevator, trying to ignore the small, warm feeling blooming in her chest, a feeling she quickly reminded herself was inappropriate, unprofessional, and almost certainly a very bad idea. Dante Rossi was her boss. He was dangerous, controlling, and completely unavailable in every way that mattered. And yet here she was, replaying his voice in her head, the way it had cracked ever so slightly around the word careful. She reached the elevator and pressed the button, glancing back once toward his office door, still closed, still silent. Whatever storm was brewing behind that door, she had a feeling it was far from finished. The day had barely begun to shift, and already the ground beneath both of them felt less steady than it had that morning. As the elevator doors slid open, Elena stepped inside, unaware that behind the closed door she had just left, Dante Rossi was standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, wrestling with a feeling he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a single thought kept repeating itself, quiet, but insistent. He did not want her to go tonight, and it had nothing to do with safety at all. The elevator descended, carrying Elena away, and Dante remained behind, caught in the uncomfortable silence of a man who had built his entire life on control, now discovering that the one thing he could not control was his own heart. Marco stayed just outside the office a moment longer, watching Dante through the half-open door. He had seen his friend threaten men twice his size without blinking. He had seen him negotiate deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime, all without a flicker of emotion crossing his face. But this quiet unraveling over a woman leaving early for a date, was something entirely new, and Marco intended to enjoy every second of it. You are staring at the wall, Marco said, finally stepping inside. I am thinking, Dante replied. About the ledgers? About nothing. Marco leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, clearly settling in for a longer conversation than Dante wanted to have. You have known her 2 years. You have never once asked who she was seeing. Why now? Dante did not answer right away. He walked to the window instead, looking down at the street below, watching the small shapes of people moving through their simple, uncomplicated lives. "It is not my business," he said finally. "That has never stopped you before." Dante turned to face him, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped just enough for Marco to see something raw underneath, something that looked almost like fear. "Drop it, Marco." Marco held up his hands again, backing toward the door. "Fine, dropping it. But you should know, everyone in this building noticed. The ledgers, the security reports, the sudden urgency about camera logs from last week. You are not exactly subtle." "I do not need to be subtle. I am in charge." "Being in charge and being obvious are two very different things," Marco said, and then he was gone, leaving Dante alone with his thoughts once more. Dante sat back down at his desk, staring at the closed folder in front of him, the one Elena had finished far too quickly, the one that had bought him only a few extra hours of her presence. He thought about Oliver, a name he had never heard before today, a stranger who apparently had the right to spend an evening with a woman Dante had somehow, without meaning to, come to think of as his. The thought startled him. He had never allowed himself to think in those terms before, not about her, not about anyone. He built walls for a living, walls of protection, walls of silence, walls that kept people out and kept his world running exactly the way he wanted it to run. And somehow, without his permission, Elena had slipped past every single one of them. He picked up his phone, scrolling through nothing in particular, then set it down again. He picked up a pen, then set that down too. Nothing in the room could hold his attention, because his mind kept circling back to the same unwelcome thought. In a few hours, she would be sitting across from another man, laughing at his jokes, maybe reaching across the table to touch his hand the way she sometimes touched Dante's arm when she was trying to calm him down during a difficult meeting. The thought made something twist uncomfortably in his chest, something he refused to call jealousy, though that was exactly what it was. Outside his office, the afternoon light began to shift, the sun sliding lower in the sky, and somewhere across the city, Elena was getting ready for her evening, unaware that the man she worked for was sitting alone in his office, undone by a feeling he did not yet have the courage to name. The clock on the wall read 4:15 when Dante finally stood up and walked out of his office, his steps quick and purposeful, though he had no destination in mind. He found himself in the hallway outside the small break room, where Elena was gathering her things, a light jacket draped over her arm, her bag slung over one shoulder. She looked up when she heard him approaching. "Something else?" "No," Dante said, then immediately contradicted himself. "Actually, yes. Where are you meeting him?" Elena paused, clearly surprised by the question. "A restaurant downtown." "Why?" "Which restaurant?" "Dante." Her voice carried a note of warning now, gentle but firm. "This is not a business matter." "I like to know where my employees are in the evening," he said, the excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, as though she were seeing something in him she had suspected for a while, but had never been entirely sure of until now. "It is called Rosalie's," she said finally, "on 6th Street, 7 o'clock. Dante nodded once, filing the information away without fully understanding why he needed it. "Fine, enjoy your evening." "Thank you," Elena said, and there was something gentle in her voice now, something almost kind, as though she pitied him a little for whatever battle he was fighting inside himself. She walked past him toward the elevator, and this time, he did not call her back. He simply watched her go, the doors sliding shut, carrying her away into an evening that suddenly felt, to him, like the beginning of something he could not control, and could not stop, and was only just beginning to understand. Dante did not go home when the workday ended. Instead, he sat in his office long after the rest of the staff had left, the building falling quiet around him, the hum of the city outside the only sound to keep him company. He told himself he was reviewing contracts, checking figures, catching up on things he had ignored earlier in the day. In truth, he was watching the clock, counting down the hours until 7, wondering what Elena was doing at that exact moment, what she was wearing, whether she was nervous, whether she was excited. He hated that he cared. He hated it more than he had hated almost anything in his life, and that alone told him something important, something he was not ready to face directly. At 6:30, his phone buzzed. It was Marco. You still at the office? Marco asked when Dante picked up. Where else would I be? I do not know. Maybe following Elena to her restaurant? That is ridiculous, Dante said, though the idea had already crossed his mind more than once in the last hour. Is it? Because you have been acting strange all day, and I know you well enough to recognize the signs. What signs? Marco laughed, low and amused. The signs of a man who has finally met something he cannot control. It is almost funny, watching you struggle with a feeling instead of a rival gang or a business deal gone wrong. Dante said nothing, staring out the window at the darkening sky, the city lights beginning to flicker on below him like scattered stars fallen to earth. Come have a drink with me, Marco continued. Get your mind off it. I am fine. You are not fine. You have been staring at that same folder for 20 minutes without turning a single page. Dante glanced down and realized Marco was right. The folder in front of him had not moved since he sat down. He closed it slowly, feeling suddenly foolish, though he would never admit that out loud. Fine, he said. One drink. They met at a small bar a few blocks from the office, a place Dante often used for quiet conversations that required privacy without formality. Marco was already there when Dante arrived, 2 glasses poured, waiting on the table between them. So? Marco said as Dante sat down. Tell me honestly, what is going on with you and Elena? Nothing is going on. Then why does it feel like something is going on? Dante picked up his glass, turning it slowly in his hand, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light of the bar. She works for me. That is all. You have never once cared who any of your other employees date, Marco pointed out. You barely remember their names half the time. But Elena mentions one date, one single dinner, and suddenly you are rearranging the entire day just to keep her close. Dante did not answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his drink instead, letting the silence stretch between them, heavy with things neither of them wanted to say aloud. I do not like not knowing things, Dante said finally. That is all this is. I do not know this man. I do not know if he is trustworthy. It is a matter of caution. It is a matter of jealousy, Marco said bluntly. And you know it. Dante's jaw tightened, but he did not argue, which told Marco everything he needed to know. Look, Marco said, his tone softening slightly. I am not trying to give you trouble. I am just saying, if you feel something for her, maybe it is time to admit it, instead of inventing excuses about ledgers and security reports. It is complicated, Dante said quietly. Everything with you is complicated. That is not an excuse. Dante set his glass down, staring at the table, his mind circling back once again to Elena, to the restaurant on 6th Street, to the stranger named Oliver who was, at this very moment, likely sitting across from her, sharing a meal, sharing conversation, sharing an evening that Dante had no right to interrupt and yet desperately wanted to. I should not have let her go, Dante muttered. You could not have stopped her, Marco said, and even if you could, you should not have. She deserves a life outside of the one you drag her into every single day. The words stung more than Marco probably intended, but they were true, and Dante knew it. Elena had given years of loyalty, patience, and quiet strength to an organization that offered her nothing in return but a paycheck and the constant risk that came with working so closely to a man like Dante Rossi. She deserved better. She deserved someone uncomplicated, someone who could offer her a normal life, dinners that did not require security checks, evenings that did not carry the weight of danger simply by association. And yet, despite knowing all of this, despite understanding every reason why he should let her go and never look back, Dante could not shake the feeling that something inside him refused to accept it. I need to see her, Dante said suddenly, standing up from the table. Dante, do not do something foolish. I am not going to interrupt anything. I just need to know she is safe. Marco sighed, recognizing the look in his friend's eyes, the same determined expression he wore before making any decision that could not be undone. This is a mistake. Probably, Dante admitted, but I am going anyway. He left the bar without finishing his drink, stepping out into the cool evening air, his mind made up despite every rational argument telling him otherwise. He told himself he was simply checking on her safety, nothing more, though deep down he knew the truth was far more complicated than that. The drive to 6th Street felt longer than it should have, every red light stretching into an eternity, every slow car ahead of him testing the limits of his patience. By the time he arrived near Rosalie's, it was already past 7:30, and through the restaurant's large front window, he could see Elena seated at a small table near the back, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders, a soft smile on her face, as she listened to the man seated across from her. Dante parked across the street and sat in his car, watching, hating himself for watching, unable to stop. Oliver looked exactly as unremarkable as Dante had expected, an ordinary man in a simple sweater, nothing threatening about him at all, nothing that should have justified the storm building inside Dante's chest. And yet, watching Elena laugh at something the man said, watching her lean forward slightly, engaged and genuinely happy, Dante felt something sharp and unfamiliar twist deep inside him. He had seen men die in front of him without feeling this unsettled. He had negotiated deals worth fortunes without his hands trembling even slightly, but watching Elena smile at another man across a restaurant table, he felt more exposed and more powerless than he had in years. His phone buzzed. It was Marco again. "Please tell me you did not actually drive over there," Marco said when Dante answered. "I am just making sure she is safe. You are sitting outside the restaurant like some kind of jealous ghost, are you not?" Dante did not answer, which was answer enough. "Dante, listen to me," Marco said, his voice serious now. "If you go in there, if you make a scene, you will humiliate her, and you will humiliate yourself. Whatever you are feeling, this is not the way to handle it." "I am not going to make a scene." "Then what exactly is your plan?" Dante had no answer, because he had not thought that far ahead. He had simply needed to see her, needed to confirm with his own eyes that she was safe, and now that he had confirmed it, now that he could see clearly she was perfectly fine, laughing and comfortable, he found himself unable to simply drive away. Inside the restaurant, Elena's phone buzzed on the table beside her plate. She glanced down at the screen, a small frown crossing her face when she saw Marco's name flashing across it, followed quickly by a text message that read simply, "Do not look now, but check the street outside." Elena excused herself for a moment, telling Oliver she needed to step outside briefly to take a call, and walked toward the restaurant's front entrance. Through the glass, she immediately spotted Dante's car parked across the street, and inside it, unmistakably, Dante himself, sitting perfectly still, watching. Her chest tightened with a mixture of frustration and something else entirely, something warmer and more complicated than simple annoyance. She stepped outside into the cool evening air and crossed the street directly toward his car, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Dante's stomach dropped when he saw her approaching. He briefly considered starting the car and driving away, but it was already too late. Elena reached the passenger side door and knocked firmly on the window. He had no choice but to roll it down. "Care to explain yourself?" Elena asked, her arms crossed, her expression a careful mixture of exasperation and disbelief. "I was in the neighborhood," Dante said weakly. "You do not live anywhere near 6th Street. I had business nearby." "At 7:30 on a Friday evening? What kind of business?" Dante opened his mouth, searching for an explanation that would sound remotely believable, but nothing came. The silence stretched between them, heavy and honest in a way their conversations rarely were. "Dante," Elena said, her voice softening slightly. "Why are you really here?" He looked up at her, and for a moment, the careful control he wore like armor every single day of his life slipped just enough for her to see something underneath, something raw and uncertain and entirely unfamiliar on the face of a man known throughout the city for his unshakable composure. "I do not know," he admitted quietly, and for once it was the complete truth. Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally speaking again. "Go home, Dante. I will see you at the office tomorrow." She turned and walked back across the street without waiting for a response, disappearing back into the warm glow of the restaurant, leaving Dante alone in his car, with nothing but his own tangled thoughts for company. He watched her return to her table, watched Oliver look up with a curious smile, watched her offer some explanation that made the other man laugh gently before the conversation resumed. Dante sat there for several more minutes, engine still off, hands resting uselessly on the steering wheel, before finally admitting to himself what he had been avoiding all day. This was not about safety. This was not about caution or business or control. This was something far simpler and far more terrifying than any threat he had ever faced in his life. He was falling for Elena Marchetti, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Eventually, he started the car and drove away, though every mile he put between himself and that restaurant felt like walking away from something he desperately did not want to lose. He drove without any real destination in mind, the city lights blurring past his window, his thoughts circling endlessly around the same unavoidable truth. By the time he arrived home, it was nearly 9, and the house felt emptier than it ever had before, the silence pressing in around him in a way it never used to. He poured himself a drink he did not really want and sat alone in his study, staring at nothing, replaying the entire day in his mind, every excuse he had invented, every moment of unguarded honesty that had slipped through his carefully maintained walls. Marco called again around 10, checking in, making sure his friend had not done anything else reckless. "I saw her," Dante said simply. When Marco asked how the evening had gone, "She caught me." "Of course she did. She is smarter than both of us combined. She told me to go home." "Good advice," Marco said. "Did you listen?" Eventually. There was a brief pause on the line before Marco spoke again, his tone gentler than before. "You know this cannot continue the way it has been, right? The excuses, the games, the sudden trips across town to watch her through a restaurant window. Eventually, you are going to have to say something real to her, or you are going to lose whatever chance you still have." Dante closed his eyes, leaning back against his chair, the weight of the entire day settling over him like something heavy and inescapable. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." Across town, inside the warm glow of Rosalie's restaurant, Elena sat across from Oliver, smiling politely at his stories, laughing at the appropriate moments, engaging in the easy, comfortable conversation of a pleasant first date. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the car parked across the street, to the look on Dante's face when she had confronted him, to the raw honesty in his voice when he admitted he did not know why he had come. She had worked for Dante Rossi for 2 years. She had seen him negotiate impossible deals, control dangerous men with nothing more than a look, build an empire through sheer force of will and careful calculation. She had never once seen him look as lost and uncertain as he had tonight, sitting in his car outside a restaurant, undone by feelings he clearly did not know how to handle. And despite every reasonable instinct telling her to ignore it, to enjoy her evening with a kind and uncomplicated man who had no connection to the dangerous world Dante inhabited, Elena found herself unable to stop thinking about the man she had left sitting alone in his car, the man whose carefully controlled world had, for just a moment tonight, come completely undone because of her. The evening continued, dinner giving way to dessert, conversation drifting through easy topics, but Elena's mind remained elsewhere, caught somewhere between the pleasant present in front of her and the complicated, dangerous, undeniable pull of a man she had never expected to feel anything for, beyond simple professional loyalty. By the time the date ended, and Oliver walked her to her car, offering a polite and friendly goodnight, Elena already knew, with quiet certainty, that whatever had shifted today between her and Dante was not something either of them would be able to ignore for much longer. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray sky, clouds hanging low over the city as if mirroring the unsettled mood inside the office building where Dante Rossi ran his empire. Elena arrived at her usual time, carrying her coffee and her tablet, prepared for whatever the day might bring, though she suspected it would not be an ordinary one. She found Dante already in his office, standing by the window, his back to the door, his posture stiff and unusually tense. He did not turn when she entered, though she knew he had heard her. "Good morning," she said carefully. "Morning," he replied, still facing the window. Elena set her things down at her desk just outside his office and waited, sensing that today required patience rather than her usual directness. She had spent much of the previous night thinking about what had happened outside the restaurant, replaying his words, his expression, the strange vulnerability that had cracked through his usual composure. She did not know exactly what to expect from him this morning, but she suspected it would not be simple. A few minutes later, Dante finally turned from the window and walked toward his desk, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena could see the effort it took him to maintain it. "We need to discuss yesterday," he said. "Which part exactly?" Elena asked, raising an eyebrow. "The ledgers, the security reports, or the part where you followed me to a restaurant and sat outside watching?" Dante's jaw tightened at her directness, but he did not deny any of it. "I was checking on your safety. You already used that excuse last night. It did not work then either." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, though whether the frustration was directed at her or at himself, Elena could not entirely tell. "Fine," he said finally. "I was not just checking on your safety." "Then what were you doing?" Dante hesitated, the silence stretching between them long enough to feel uncomfortable. Elena did not rush him, did not fill the quiet with unnecessary words, simply waited, giving him the space to say whatever he needed to say, though she suspected he was not yet ready to say it fully. "I do not like the idea of you with someone else," he said finally, the words coming out stiff and reluctant, as though each one cost him something significant to admit. "Why not?" Elena pressed gently. "I am allowed to have a life outside of this office, Dante. I am allowed to go on dates." "I know that. Then why does it bother you so much?" Dante's hands curled into fists at his sides, though his voice remained controlled. "Because I do not like thinking about you laughing at someone else's jokes. I do not like imagining you across a table from a man who knows nothing about the person you actually are, the strength it takes to work in a world like this one, the patience you show every single day dealing with me, and everything that comes with this job." Elena's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his words, more open than anything he had ever said to her before. "Dante, let me finish," he interrupted, his voice gaining momentum now, as though once he had started, he could not stop the words from coming. "I have spent 2 years telling myself that what I feel for you is simply respect, simply gratitude for your loyalty. I told myself that watching you every day, relying on you more than I rely on anyone else in my life, meant nothing beyond professional necessity. But last night, watching you smile at another man, I realized I have been lying to myself for a very long time." The office fell completely silent, the weight of his confession settling over both of them like something too large and too fragile to touch carelessly. Elena stood perfectly still, her heart pounding unexpectedly fast, unsure of how to respond to a version of Dante Rossi she had never seen before, stripped of his usual armor, standing exposed and uncertain in front of her. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked quietly. "Because I am tired of pretending it is not true," Dante said, "and because after last night, I do not think either of us can keep ignoring it." Elena took a slow breath, processing the weight of everything he had just said. Part of her had suspected this for weeks, had noticed the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way his eyes lingered slightly too long, the way his voice softened almost imperceptibly whenever he spoke to her, compared to everyone else in the office. But suspecting something and hearing it confirmed directly were two very different experiences entirely. "This is complicated," she said finally. "I know. You are my employer. Whatever happens between us could affect everything, my job, my safety, the way people in this organization treat me." "I know that too," Dante said, "and I have thought about every single one of those complications more times than I can count since last night, but none of them change how I feel." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of manipulation, any hint that this confession was simply another tactic, another way of maintaining control over her life, the way he controlled everything else around him. But she found none. What she saw instead was raw uncertainty, a man who had built his entire identity around strength and control, now standing before her completely unguarded, terrified of a feeling he could not manage or contain. "I need time to think," she said finally. Dante nodded slowly, though disappointment flickered briefly across his expression before he managed to hide it. "That is fair." Elena turned to leave the office, but his voice stopped her once more, just as it had the day before. "Elena," she turned back. "Yes? Was he good to you last night?" The question caught her off guard, softer and more vulnerable than she expected. He was kind, she said honestly. But kind is not always enough. She left the office then, leaving Dante alone with the weight of everything that had just passed between them, uncertain whether he had made things better or infinitely more complicated by finally speaking the truth aloud. The rest of the morning passed in an uneasy quiet, both of them moving through their usual routines with careful distance, neither quite ready to address what had happened, though both were acutely aware of the shift that had occurred between them. Marco noticed immediately when he arrived just before noon, sensing the tension thick enough to cut through with a knife. "What happened?" he asked Dante, finding him alone in his office, staring blankly at paperwork he clearly was not reading. "I told her," Dante said simply. Marco's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You actually told her?" "I told her everything." "And?" "She needs time to think." Marco let out a low whistle, sitting down across from his friend with an expression somewhere between impressed and concerned. "That took courage. I did not think you had it in you, honestly." "Neither did I," Dante admitted. "How do you feel?" Dante considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Terrified," he said finally, the admission surprising even himself. "I have never been terrified of anything in my life. Not real danger, not rivals, not the possibility of losing everything I have built. But the thought of her walking away because of this terrifies me more than anything ever has." Marco studied his friend carefully, recognizing the sincerity in his voice, understanding perhaps for the first time just how deeply this feeling had taken root inside a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding vulnerability of any kind. "Give her the time she asked for," Marco advised. "Do not push, do not chase, do not send more flowers or invent more excuses to keep her close. Let her come to her own conclusion. And if her conclusion is that this is a mistake, then you accept it," Marco said simply, "and you let her go, because forcing this would only prove that you never truly deserved her feelings in the first place." The words settled heavily over Dante, uncomfortable but true, and he nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in them even as every instinct in his body screamed against the idea of simply waiting and hoping. Meanwhile, at her own desk just outside the office, Elena struggled through her own tangled thoughts, unable to focus fully on her work, her mind circling endlessly around Dante's confession. She thought about Oliver, kind and uncomplicated, offering her a life free from danger, free from the constant tension that came with working so closely to a man in Dante's position. She thought about safety, about the sensible path, about everything logic told her she should choose. But logic had very little to do with the way her heart had raced when Dante admitted, standing exposed and vulnerable in his office, that he could not stop thinking about her. Logic had very little to do with the warmth that spread through her chest at the memory of his voice cracking slightly around the words, "I do not like thinking about you with someone else." She spent her lunch break sitting alone in a small park near the office, turning the entire situation over in her mind, weighing every possible outcome, every risk, every consequence. She thought about the years she had spent building a life for herself, careful and independent, refusing to let herself become entangled in anything that could compromise her safety or her sense of self. And she thought about how completely, unexpectedly, all of that careful independence had been shaken by one honest confession from a man she had never allowed herself to consider in that way before. By the time she returned to the office that afternoon, she still did not have a clear answer, but she had made peace with one simple truth. Whatever happened next, she could no longer pretend that her feelings for Dante Rossi were purely professional. That ship, it seemed, had already sailed sometime during the quiet, complicated months they had spent working side by side, long before either of them had been willing to acknowledge it out loud. The afternoon brought new challenges that pulled Dante's attention away from his personal turmoil, at least temporarily. A business associate arrived unexpectedly, demanding an urgent meeting regarding a deal that had recently fallen through, and Dante spent nearly 3 hours locked in tense negotiations, his usual sharp focus slightly dulled by the events of the morning, though he fought hard to keep his mind on the conversation at hand. Elena worked efficiently throughout the afternoon, handling calls, organizing paperwork, managing the flow of visitors and messages with her usual practiced calm, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the way her gaze occasionally drifted toward Dante's closed office door, or the way she seemed to hold her breath slightly whenever his voice carried through the walls. By early evening, the office had mostly emptied, the business associate finally departing after reaching a tentative agreement, leaving Dante exhausted and drained in ways that had little to do with the negotiations themselves. He sat alone in his office once more, the events of the entire day settling heavily over him, uncertain what tomorrow might bring, uncertain whether Elena's silence throughout the afternoon meant she was leaning toward acceptance or toward walking away entirely. He did not seek her out again that evening, honoring Marco's advice despite every instinct urging him otherwise. Instead, he watched through his office window as she gathered her things at the end of the day, moving with her usual quiet grace, offering him only a brief, unreadable glance before heading toward the elevator. "Good night, Dante," she said simply, pausing at his door for just a moment. "Good night, Elena," he replied, his voice carrying more weight and uncertainty than the simple words should have allowed. She left without saying anything further, and Dante remained behind once again, alone with his thoughts, wondering whether the honesty he had finally allowed himself to express had brought them closer together, or had irreparably complicated the fragile balance they had maintained for 2 careful years. Outside, as Elena walked toward her car through the cool evening air, she found herself replaying his words one final time, the raw vulnerability in his voice, the fear beneath his usual controlled exterior, and somewhere between the office building and her car, amid the quiet hum of the city settling into evening, she realized with startling clarity that despite every reasonable argument against it, despite every risk and every complication, she did not want to walk away from whatever this was becoming between them. She just was not yet ready to admit that to him directly, not until she understood her own feelings clearly enough to trust them completely. 2 days passed in careful, quiet distance. Dante kept his word, resisting every urge to push Elena for an answer, though the effort cost him more restraint than almost anything he had ever done in his life. He buried himself in work instead, handling meetings, reviewing contracts, keeping his hands and his mind occupied enough to avoid dwelling too long on the uncertainty hanging over him. Elena, for her part, continued her duties with the same steady professionalism she always brought to the office, though she found herself watching Dante more closely than before, noticing small things she had never paid attention to previously. The way his shoulders relaxed slightly whenever she brought him coffee without being asked. The way his voice softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever he spoke directly to her compared to anyone else in the building. She had worked beside this man for 2 years, and only now was she beginning to truly see him. On the 3rd day, Marco arrived at the office earlier than usual, finding Dante already at his desk, though not working. Instead, Dante was staring at a folder in front of him, his expression unusually troubled. "What is that?" Marco asked, nodding toward the folder. "Information about Oliver," Dante admitted. "I had someone look into him." Marco frowned slightly. "I thought we agreed you would give her space." "I did give her space," Dante said. "This has nothing to do with pushing her toward a decision. This is about making sure she is not in danger." "And what did you find?" Dante slid the folder across the desk, and Marco opened it, scanning the contents quickly. The report detailed Oliver's background, his employment history as a teacher, his finances, his social connections. Nothing in the report suggested any obvious danger, no criminal history, no concerning associations, but buried near the end of the document was a detail that caught Marco's attention immediately. "He has been asking questions," Marco said slowly, reading further. "About you, about the business." "Exactly," Dante said, his jaw tight. 2 weeks ago, before he ever asked Elena out, he was seen at a bar frequented by people connected to rival organizations, asking casual questions about Elena Marchetti and her employer, about me. Marco set the folder down, his earlier amusement replaced by genuine concern. "You think he approached her deliberately, to get close to you?" "I do not know what to think," Dante admitted. "It could be nothing, curiosity maybe, once people realized who she worked for. Or it could be something more calculated." "Have you told her?" "Not yet. I do not want to accuse an innocent man of something he may not have actually done, especially not while she is still deciding what she wants regarding us." It would look like exactly the kind of manipulation she would expect from someone in my position. Marco considered this carefully, understanding the delicate position his friend found himself in. But if he really is using her to get information about you, she deserves to know, regardless of anything happening between you and her personally. Dante nodded slowly, already having reached the same conclusion himself, though the timing troubled him deeply. He did not want Elena to think this was simply another excuse, another manufactured reason to interfere with her personal life. He needed her to understand that his concern, this time, was rooted in something entirely separate from his own feelings. That afternoon, Elena knocked on his office door, finding him still staring at the same folder from earlier. "You wanted to see me?" she asked. Dante hesitated only briefly, before deciding honesty, however uncomfortable, remained the only path forward. "Sit down, please." Elena took a seat across from his desk, sensing immediately from his tone that whatever he was about to say carried real weight. "What is going on? I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am not telling you this to manipulate your feelings or to interfere with your personal life out of jealousy," Dante began carefully. "I had someone look into Oliver's background purely as a matter of standard caution regarding anyone who becomes close to people in my organization." Elena's expression tightened slightly. "Dante, we discussed this. I do not need you investigating people I choose to date. I understand your frustration, and under different circumstances, I would agree with you completely," Dante said. "But what came back in that report is something you deserve to know, regardless of anything happening between us." He slid the folder across the desk toward her. Elena opened it cautiously, scanning the contents with growing confusion, until she reached the section detailing Oliver's questions at the bar weeks earlier, questions specifically about her and about Dante's business. Her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to hurt as she processed the information. "This does not necessarily mean anything," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "People ask questions all the time. It could be entirely innocent curiosity." "It could be," Dante agreed gently. "I am not asking you to assume the worst. I am simply asking you to be aware, to protect yourself, regardless of what you ultimately decide to do with this information." Elena closed the folder slowly, her mind racing through every conversation she had shared with Oliver over the past few weeks, searching for any small detail that might confirm or deny the troubling possibility now laid before her. She thought about how quickly he had approached her at the small coffee shop where they had first met, how naturally curious he had seemed about her work, questions she had brushed aside at the time as simple friendly interest. "I need to think about this," she said finally, standing up from her chair. "Take whatever time you need," Dante said. "And Elena, regardless of what you decide about him, or about anything between us, I want you to know that my concern here is genuine. This has nothing to do with wanting to control who you see." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of manipulation, but found only sincere concern, the same raw honesty she had witnessed days earlier when he confessed his feelings for her. She nodded once, silently, and left his office, carrying the weight of this new uncertainty with her. That evening, Elena arranged to meet Oliver for coffee, telling herself she simply wanted clarity, one way or another, before making any further decisions about her feelings or her future. They met at the same small coffee shop where they had first encountered each other weeks earlier, the familiar surroundings feeling suddenly unfamiliar under the weight of her new suspicions. "You seem distracted tonight," Oliver observed, sliding into the seat across from her. "I have a question for you," Elena said, deciding directness would serve her better than careful maneuvering. "A few weeks before you asked me out, were you at a bar downtown, asking people questions about me and about my employer?" Oliver's expression flickered, just briefly, a small crack in his usual easy confidence, though he recovered quickly. "Where is this coming from? Just answer the question, please." He hesitated a moment longer before sighing, his shoulders sinking slightly. "Yes," he admitted. "I was curious. People talk about Dante Rossi in this city, and when I heard his assistant frequented that coffee shop, I admit I was interested in learning more before ever approaching you directly." Elena's stomach tightened with disappointment, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "So, this entire relationship, from the very beginning, was about him, not me?" That is not fair, Oliver said quickly. It started that way, yes. But the moment I actually met you, everything changed. I genuinely enjoyed our time together. I still do. But it started as an attempt to get close to me because of who I work for, Elena said, the words settling heavily between them. Oliver did not deny it, and his silence confirmed everything Elena needed to know. She sat quietly for a long moment, processing the disappointment. Though beneath the hurt, she recognized something clarifying as well. A sense of relief that the decision facing her had suddenly become far simpler than it had been just hours earlier. I think we should stop seeing each other, she said finally, her voice calm, despite the complicated emotions swirling beneath the surface. Elena, please, give me a chance to explain further. You just did, she said gently but firmly, and I appreciate your honesty, even now. But I cannot continue something built on deception, regardless of how genuine your feelings might have become afterward. She left the coffee shop that evening with a strange mixture of disappointment and clarity. Disappointment that her judgment had been so easily misled, but clarity regarding exactly where her heart truly belonged. A realization that had been building steadily over the past several days, waiting patiently for her to finally acknowledge it fully. She drove straight to Dante's house that night, arriving unannounced, her decision made before she had fully processed every implication of what she was about to do. She found him standing in his doorway moments after she knocked, clearly surprised by her unexpected arrival. Elena, is everything all right? I ended things with Oliver, she said simply, stepping past him into the entryway without waiting for an invitation. He admitted everything, the questions, the curiosity about you, all of it. Dante closed the door slowly behind her, his expression carefully guarded, though Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty he was clearly trying hard to contain. I am sorry, he said. I know that could not have been easy to hear. It was not, Elena admitted. But it clarified something for me, something I think I already knew but was too afraid to fully accept. What is that? Elena stepped closer, closing the remaining distance between them, her heart pounding steadily as she prepared to say the words she had spent days avoiding, weeks perhaps, if she was being completely honest with herself. That whatever this is, between you and me, it is not something I want to walk away from, she said quietly. Even knowing every complication it brings, every risk, every difficulty that comes with caring for someone in your position. Dante stared at her, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, disbelief giving way slowly to something warmer, something he had not allowed himself to fully hope for since the moment he first admitted his feelings days earlier. Are you certain? He asked quietly. Because once we cross this line, there is no simple way back to how things were before. I know, Elena said. I have thought about it more than you probably realize, and I am certain. The space between them felt charged, heavy with everything unspoken across the past several days. Every careful glance, every restrained word, every moment either of them had denied what was steadily growing beneath the surface of their professional relationship. Dante reached out slowly, his hand finding hers, and for the first time since this entire complicated situation began, neither of them pulled away. The following morning brought a kind of quiet that neither Dante nor Elena had experienced in a very long time, a peace that settled over both of them despite the uncertainty still surrounding exactly how their new understanding would translate into daily life. Elena arrived at the office at her usual time, though today felt different in ways both subtle and significant, the air between them lighter, less burdened by unspoken tension. Dante was already waiting near her desk when she arrived, an uncharacteristic gesture that immediately caught her attention. Good morning, he said, his voice carrying a warmth she rarely allowed herself to hear, directed at her so openly. Good morning, she replied, unable to fully suppress the small smile tugging at her lips. Neither of them quite knew how to navigate this new territory, unsure whether affection belonged in the same space where professional boundaries had governed their interactions for 2 careful years. But something had shifted permanently the previous night, and both of them recognized there was no returning to the careful distance they had maintained before. Marco arrived shortly after, immediately sensing the change in atmosphere the moment he stepped through the door. He glanced between Dante and Elena, noting the way they stood slightly closer together than usual. The way Dante's expression had softened considerably compared to the tense frustration Marco had grown accustomed to seeing over the past several days. "Well," Marco said, a knowing grin spreading across his face. "It seems something finally happened." "Do not start," Dante warned, though there was no real heat behind the words. "I am simply observing," Marco said, raising his hands in mock innocence. "Though I will say, it is about time. Watching you struggle through excuses about ledgers and security reports was becoming exhausting for everyone involved." Elena laughed softly, the sound genuine and unguarded. He was rather obvious about it, was he not? "Obvious does not begin to describe it," Marco confirmed, chuckling as he headed toward his own office, leaving the two of them alone once more. The following weeks brought new challenges neither of them had fully anticipated, adjustments that came with navigating a relationship built within the complicated framework of their professional lives. Dante found himself more careful, more intentional in how he balanced authority with personal feeling, understanding that Elena needed to maintain her sense of independence and respect within the office, regardless of what existed between them privately. Elena, for her part, discovered a side of Dante few people ever had the opportunity to witness, a man capable of genuine tenderness beneath the controlled exterior he presented to the rest of the world. He listened more carefully now, asked about her day with real curiosity, rather than simple courtesy, and allowed himself small moments of vulnerability he would have previously guarded fiercely against. Not everyone within the organization received the news of their relationship with equal enthusiasm. Some members of Dante's inner circle expressed quiet concern regarding how this personal connection might affect professional dynamics, worried that favoritism or emotional decision-making could complicate the careful balance Dante had maintained for years. Dante addressed these concerns directly and firmly, making it clear that his personal relationship with Elena would never interfere with the standards he expected from everyone within the organization, including himself. One particular afternoon, several weeks into their new relationship, tested this resolve directly. A dispute arose between two department heads regarding resource allocation, a disagreement that required careful, impartial judgment from Dante to resolve fairly. Elena, aware of the potential for people to question whether her closeness to Dante might influence his decisions, deliberately removed herself from the discussion entirely, ensuring no one could accuse either of them of allowing personal feelings to compromise professional integrity. Dante noticed this careful consideration and addressed it with her privately afterward. "You did not need to remove yourself from that meeting," he said. "Your input has always been valuable, regardless of our personal relationship." "I know," Elena replied, "but I also know how quickly people look for reasons to doubt fairness, especially in an organization like this one. I would rather remove any possibility of doubt entirely than risk undermining the trust you have built with your team." Dante studied her for a long moment, admiration clear in his expression. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly. "Even now, you think of everyone else's perception before your own comfort." "Someone has to maintain some sense of caution around here," Elena teased gently. "You are hardly capable of it yourself, given how obvious you were about your feelings before you finally admitted them." Dante laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that Elena had rarely heard from him before their relationship began, and the warmth of it settled comfortably between them, a small reminder of how far they had both come since that fateful afternoon when she casually mentioned having a date scheduled for the evening. As months passed, their relationship deepened steadily, built not on the dramatic intensity of their earlier days together but on quieter, more consistent foundations of trust and mutual respect. Dante learned to communicate his concerns directly, rather than manufacturing excuses or unnecessary tasks to keep Elena close. Elena, in turn, learned to appreciate the complicated protective instincts that came naturally to a man who had spent his entire life guarding everything and everyone important to him. Marco remained a constant source of gentle teasing throughout this transition, though beneath his humor lay genuine happiness for his closest friend, someone he had known for years to be capable of remarkable strength but rarely allowed himself moments of genuine personal happiness. "You know," Marco said one evening, joining Dante for a quiet drink after a particularly long day, "I never thought I would see you like this." "Like what?" Dante asked. "Content," Marco said simply. "Settled. For years, I watched you build this entire world around control and power, convinced those things alone would bring you satisfaction. But watching you with Elena these past few months, I have realized something I do not think you fully understood about yourself before. What is that? That control was never really what you wanted, Marco said. You wanted something real, something you could not manufacture or force through sheer will alone. And you found it, almost by accident, in the one person who never once tried to manipulate or control you, the way everyone else in your life always has. Dante considered this quietly, recognizing the truth in his friend's observation. For years, he had measured his success by the empire he built, by the fear and respect he commanded from everyone around him. But none of that had ever brought him the quiet satisfaction he now felt in ordinary, simple moments with Elena, moments of easy conversation, shared meals, comfortable silence that required no performance or careful strategy to maintain. Elena, meanwhile, found her own sense of fulfillment growing steadily alongside their relationship. She had spent years building careful independence, protecting herself from vulnerability in a world that offered little safety or certainty. But with Dante, she discovered a different kind of strength, one built not on guarded distance, but on the courage to remain open despite every risk involved. Their relationship was far from perfect. They argued occasionally, disagreed on matters both personal and professional, navigated the inevitable complications that arose from blending their private lives with the demanding world Dante inhabited. But through each disagreement, each challenge, they discovered a partnership built on honest communication, rather than the careful games and manufactured excuses that had once characterized Dante's approach to managing his feelings. Nearly a year after that fateful evening when Elena first mentioned having a date scheduled for the night, the two of them found themselves back at Rosalie's restaurant, the same small establishment on 6th Street, where Dante had once sat outside in his car, undone by jealousy he refused to acknowledge. This time, however, he sat across from her at their table, no longer hiding outside in the shadows, no longer inventing excuses or manufacturing tasks to occupy her time. "Do you remember this place?" Elena asked, smiling as she glanced around the familiar restaurant. "How could I forget?" Dante replied, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "This is where I made an absolute fool of myself, sitting outside in my car like some kind of jealous ghost, as Marco so kindly put it at the time." Elena laughed softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You were rather obvious even then." "I was terrified," Dante admitted honestly. "Terrified of feelings I had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Terrified of losing control over something I could not manage, or manipulate the way I managed everything else in my life." "And now?" Elena asked gently. Dante considered the question carefully, his gaze steady and warm as he looked at her across the table. "Now I understand that some things are worth the risk of losing control entirely," he said quietly. "You taught me that, without even trying." The evening continued in comfortable, easy conversation, free from the tension and uncertainty that had once defined their interactions outside professional obligation. Somewhere in the background, the quiet hum of the restaurant continued around them, other couples enjoying their own evenings, entirely unaware of the complicated journey that had led this particular pair back to this particular table, nearly a year after everything between them had shifted so unexpectedly. Later that night, as they walked together toward the car, Elena glanced up at Dante, studying his expression thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Following me here that first night, admitting everything you felt?" Dante shook his head firmly, no hesitation in his response. "Never," he said. "That single evening, as foolish and obvious as I was about it, changed everything for me. It forced me to confront something I had spent years avoiding, and it brought me exactly where I needed to be." Elena smiled, leaning her head gently against his shoulder as they continued walking through the cool evening air. "I suppose I should thank Oliver then," she teased. "If not for that date, none of this would have happened the way it did." Dante laughed, wrapping his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "Let us not go that far," he said, amusement clear in his voice. "I would rather simply be grateful for how everything eventually turned out, without dwelling too much on how it began." They reached the car and drove home together through familiar streets, the city lights glowing softly around them, a comfortable silence settling between them, the kind of silence that no longer required careful maneuvering or unspoken tension to navigate. It was simply peace, earned through honesty, patience, and the courage it had taken both of them to finally acknowledge what had been steadily growing between them, long before either was ready to admit it. Dante Rossi, the man once known throughout the city for his unshakable control and calculated composure, had found something he never expected to find, something no amount of power or strategy could have manufactured on its own. And Elena Marchetti, who had spent years building careful independence to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, discovered that some risks, however uncertain and complicated, were worth taking fully and completely. Their story, born from one simple, ordinary sentence about having a date scheduled for the evening, had grown into something neither of them could have predicted that quiet afternoon in Dante's office, weeks earlier, when jealousy first cracked through years of careful control, revealing something far more valuable underneath. And as they settled into the comfortable rhythm of their new life together, both of them understood clearly that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them exactly as they had found their way to each other in the first place, honestly, patiently, and together.